to this first of our series of talks in this new setting for us. Today's talk is the Marketization of Good Works, Rival Dispositions of Caring in Egypt and Turkey. And it's sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. So before we begin, I would like to announce two upcoming events, also sponsored by ISSI and with affiliated centers. So on Wednesday, September 25th, a week from today, the Center for Right-Wing Studies will host a talk, Conservative Political Infrastructure in the Age of Obama. And this is presented by Li Fang, who is a reporting fellow with the Investigative Fund at The Nation. And he's a contributing writer there. And that will be here a week from today at 4 o'clock. And on Wednesday, October 9th, the Center for Research on Social Change will host a talk, Net Time Negotiations Within the Family. That will be by Laura Robinson, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Santa Clara University. And again, that will be here on Wednesday, October 9th at 4 o'clock. Now, would you all turn off your cell phones, please? And also, if you haven't signed in, we'd really appreciate you signing in on the sign-in sheet. Is there a sign-in sheet going around?
It's right here. And it'll be
on the back table. It's really important for us to justify, for example, having this wonderful space. So we would very much appreciate you signing in only once. You don't need to sign in twice. All right. So Professor Tugal will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Cihan Tugal, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at UC Berkeley. And his research concerns mobilization, socioeconomic change, and the role of religion in sociopolitical projects. And he has a book, Passive Revolution, Absorbing the Islamic Challenge to Capitalism, out in 2009 from Stanford University Press. And it's based on an ethnography of a poor conservative district in Istanbul. And he is exploring how Islamic movements have mobilized the poor and intellectuals and then integrated them into secular market-oriented policies. And he's published in a number of journals and in broadly speaking is interested in working on bringing a cultural perspective to the study of politics and economics. So we're looking forward to his talk this afternoon, and please join me in welcoming Professor Tugal.
Okay, thanks for that nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. So today I will talk about an aspect of these questions. Again, this interaction between the middle classes, intellectuals, and the poor. But unlike my earlier work, I don't look at the question bottom up. I rather focus on the middle classes themselves. And this time, not in their leadership and religious potentials, but more so, well, not in their political leadership potentials, but in their role as providers of good works. And of course, this is a difficult concept, and I've been actually switching from one concept to the other to capture an Arabic term, khair, which can translate into 10 or 15 different words in English. And I would be happy to talk about the semantics of that after the talk in the Q&A session, but for now I will stick to this translation, good works. So basically what I'm trying to understand is how the meaning and the practice of providing for the less fortunate changes in a marketizing world. Okay, so we can redefine khair or open up khair as providing for the less fortunate, even though it's even broader than that. So the basic question I'm trying to ask is whether good works are evolving into some form of marketizing activity. So what I mean by that is this possibility. Now, I don't want to give this as an answer yet, so I'm trying to avoid a yes or no at this point. But the possibility that before marketization, providing for the less fortunate, services to the less fortunate, generated community and reduced wealth balances. But today, what providing for the less fortunate is really doing is further subordinating them and producing them as market subjects. So as responsible individuals, and responsibility defined in terms of market values. Basically, you know, waking up on time and working throughout the day and making a good salary and supporting your family, etc. I will have to open that up as well. So in a part of the literature on Khair in the last 10, 15 years or so, this transition has been more or less assumed. And this is the critical scholarship. So this is not mainstream scholarship. So critical scholars have assumed that charity, philanthropy, whatever you call it, good works in general, are now being deployed to subordinate the poor further and turn them into market subjects. But there is an alternative literature that has been emphasizing that well, it's not the alternative. The other alternative literature is not even speaking to this question, but it is basically arguing that the providers, whether they are volunteers or the people who actually give the money, are quite altruistic, and they are doing this still for the generation of community, the sustenance of community. So the question I'm trying to ask is, so the secondary or the following question is, if these orientations, these more communitarian orientations persist, how do they, and how can they in different kinds of settings? So do market-oriented orientations or do market-oriented dispositions of giving predominate in a certain setting versus another due to certain sociological, political factors? Okay, so the empirical argument is going to be that the more marketized version of giving, providing to the poor, has not become very predominant in Egypt, and still it is thriving in the last 10 or 15 years, or maybe even 20 years, but under the shadow of communitarian modes of giving. And what I mean by communitarian, as opposed to marketized, is, again, this notion that you give to the poor based on your altruism, but also to sustain the community or even produce new moral communities. And of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that the poor are not being subordinated in communitarian ways of giving, but they are being subordinated in a quite different way. They are not being pushed into being market actors necessarily, and I will come to that in detail. And by contrast, in Turkey, market-oriented giving has marginalized, almost pushed out of existence, communitarian modes of giving, at least in the more central charitable and philanthropic organizations. So the question is, why do we see this variation between the two countries? And I draw attention to three factors, ranging from the political to the more sociological and the micro-sociological. So contrasting histories of Islamic mobilization in the two countries, which is even reflected in their vocabularies, and I'll come to the vocabularies of good works in these two cases, and the specific networks and visions of charity that these Islamic mobilizations have fostered, and ultimately the states, the varieties of state benevolence merger, or the merger between the state and the philanthropies in the two cases. So to approach the question, the broader theoretical question, in the light of these examples, what I'm trying to say is we cannot simplify the whole history of the last decades in the case of Muslim giving or Muslim charity or philanthropy as a simple transition from communitarian to market-oriented. It is a very contested and open scene, even though it is becoming less and less open in some cases, as in Turkey. So, the first beginning point is, well, one of the possible beginning points, at least, is the world historical context and the world historical trends. So we cannot understand what's happening in Egypt and Turkey solely based on Egypt and Turkey, because NGOs, not only charitable NGOs and philanthropic NGOs, but all kinds of NGOs throughout the world are subject to certain pressures. And there is a broader trend of neoliberalization in the whole non-governmental world. And certainly the organizations in Turkey are taking their cues from the entire globe. Well, even that is not accurate. They're taking their cues from the West, and especially the United States. But the other thing is the NGOs also under neoliberalizing contexts compete with businesses, not only for their funding, but for their personnel. So they are trying to reconstitute themselves as alternatives to business, as competitors with business. And in such an environment, the volunteers are also pushed into becoming professional staff. So there are strong pressures that go against the altruistic or the arguably altruistic spirit of communitarian charity. So volunteerism in the end becomes a career or a stepping stone for a career. It becomes a line in the CV, and the motivating factor becomes, the primary motivating factor becomes not the religious dictates, not simple goodness, but basically from the beginning people do the volunteering with an explicit consciousness that they are going to add this to their CV as a line, and they are going to use this for advancement in the business world. But despite all of this, there are still studies that document the persistence of altruistic giving. I'm saying this, but we have to keep open the possibility that they are missing something, right? So they might be focusing too much on the altruistic cover of the whole activity and missing the underlying push for career advancement. But that becomes a research question. So when we actually dive into the context of giving, what do we actually see? So in order to study these questions, I spent some time in Egypt and Turkey collecting interviews, and 52 interviews in 17 organizations in Egypt, and 35 interviews in 12 organizations in Turkey. And I also visited the headquarters and the branches of these organizations and observed the activities of giving on site. But I'm, again, mostly focusing on the providers of care here, either the volunteers or the staff or the donors. So less focus, at least in this paper, on the receivers. So what are these 29 organizations? In each case, I focused on all of the nationally prominent organizations. So I tried to map out the whole national field. Unfortunately, in Egypt, there are two exceptions. Because two of the Salafi organizations explicitly rejected talking to me. Oh, what happened? Oh, God. Okay, there we go. So the core of the focus are these nationally prominent, visible organizations which have become household names. especially in the worlds of the more pious people in these two countries. I added to the study smaller associations too. So in each of the cases, these large and visible nationally prominent organizations range from 5 to 7 organizations. So the rest are smaller organizations. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to observe what the new entrants to the field are trying to emulate. What are they? Where are they drawing their understanding of charity from? The problem with these smaller associations is that I cannot claim that they are representative. So if we look at the mainstream scholarship on good works in the whole Middle East, even the whole Islamic world, the basic argument is that there is a move from religiously based and short-lived charity to rationalized and cumulative philanthropy. So when people give their zakat and sadaqah today, they no longer do it on an arbitrary and random basis, but there are organizations that have rationalized giving, and this creates, of course, a much more rational society where the funds go to the correct people through scientific measurement, and they do not end up just feeding one person at a time, but they actually change the lives of people for the better. Okay, so this is what mainstream scholarship is saying. And just as a footnote, zakat is the required amount of giving in Islam. There are different ways of calculating it, but very broadly speaking, it is 2.5% of your wealth minus the necessities of life. And sadaqah is the voluntary giving. And of course, there is a historical discussion about this. So this is what zakat and sadaqah are held to be in Orthodox Sunni scholarship. So I'm talking about really mainstream Islam here. But anyway, there are two problems with this argument. So the argument then is zakat and sadaqah are being spent, or increasingly being spent today in the Islamic world, in a much more rationalized way. And that is the trend. Well, two problems. First, this is the self-presentation of the new philanthropies. So here, there is really almost 1%, 100% overlap between the discourse of science and the discourse of ideology. So sciences, social sciences now only come in as a way of measuring whether they are these new philanthropies are living up to their promises. So that's the first problem. The second problem with the mainstream scholarship is it really simplifies traditional giving. So traditional giving was not exactly short-lived, not in all cases. It wasn't only religiously based, because there was a lot of institutionalization, a lot of, quote-unquote, modernization, rationalization, ever since perhaps the 16th century, so before Western impact. So, this simple opposition between tradition and modernity does not live up to much scrutiny if you know anything about early modern Islamic history, or even late medieval Islamic history. The critical scholarship, with which I'm more engaged with, draws attention to another type of transformation. So it's not simply from traditional to modernity, but from some sort of communitarian orthodox vision, which again, even the critical scholarship sort of simplifies, and I will go into that shortly too, to a more neoliberal vision that puts in the center this concept of responsibilization. So those of you who are familiar with the scholarship on neoliberalization in general would know this concept. So responsibilization is basically the singling out of the individual and her shortcomings as the real cause of poverty. So it's not fate, which is arguably at the center of orthodox religious explanations of poverty. Nor is it, the social structures. It is the individual's shortcomings that are the real causes of poverty. And therefore, the individual has to be changed. And of course, this doesn't mean this is a completely individualistic explanation. Responsibilization is not exclusively individualistic. So the individual is also seen as a result of the family and surrounding traditional culture. So traditional cultural attributes also become the causes of poverty. So arguably, the orthodox religions, whether we are talking about Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, had a more egalitarian ethos, and neoliberalization is undermining this ethos. And I won't go into the criticism of this assumption, but of course this is a very crude assumption about Orthodox religion, because Orthodox religion might not be as inegalitarian as liberalism and neoliberalism, but it is still inegalitarian and hierarchical. It has hierarchical assumptions about the world. But instead of egalitarian, I will say communitarian, in the sense that most Orthodox religions, due to variation among and within them, push people to give in order to preserve or generate a community of believers, which is certainly exclusive, but a community of believers without immense wealth differences. So I use communitarian in that sense, a morally exclusive community of believers without immense wealth differences. So based on that definition of communitarian, I will basically start with the assumption that out there are there are associations with more emphasis on communitarianism, and other associations which are more market-oriented. But this is just a beginning assumption, and we will have to complicate this as well when we go into the cases. So I talked about the world historical trends, but we have to situate these changes also in the national context of changing welfare regimes. In both of the countries I'm covering, Egypt and Turkey, there is a partial and uneven withdrawal of the state from social provision. I'm saying partial and uneven because it's not that the welfare state is completely collapsing, even though it tends to do so in the case of Egypt. But in Turkey, there is a much more complicated story, especially with the Justice and Development Party, which has been in government ever since 2002 in Turkey. So for the last 35 years, the Turkish state has been investing less and less in social provision, but the Justice and Development Party, which is an Islamically inspired party, not exactly Islamist, but Islamically inspired party, has not only continued this withdrawal, but also increased investment in some areas, such as health. So they are, even in their discourse, very pro-Obama. They're saying, we are doing the same exact thing as Obama. We are liberalizing the healthcare system and opening it up to everyone. And of course, the context is very different because in Turkey, the health system was a very corporatist health system. So the beneficiaries were really, they received a lot from the state, but the beneficiaries were well-defined employees, either in the public or private sector. So unless you are thoroughly entrenched in a certain sector, you didn't get much from the state. And the same thing can more or less be said about Egypt too, but the Egyptian state, unlike the Turkish one, simply decreased the health provision in all of these sectors, whereas the Turkish state not only dismantled this whole system, but also increased health coverage for the informal working classes, so people who do not fit into the corporatist scheme. So in Egypt, perhaps there is a more straightforward story of the state's withdrawal from provision, as exemplified by the number of food items that are subsidized, going from 18 to 4 in 15 years. So there are differences, but both countries have shifted, as much of the world, to a government-charity partnership that tries to mobilize the so-called entrepreneurial capacities of the poor in order to replace the welfare system. So, just like there are differences and parallels between the welfare contexts, there are differences and parallels between the Islamic movements too. So both countries have experienced an Islamic regeneration, maybe in the last 4 decades, 4 or 5 decades. And they have borrowed a lot from each other. First Turkey from Egypt, then Egypt from Turkey. But within the body of this Islamic regeneration, there are certain differences, and I won't talk about all of them, but I'll talk more about what is more relevant to the concept of good works. In Egypt, good works has been very tightly linked to invitation to Islam, so the concept of dawah. So dawah, again, is a term that is very difficult to translate. Perhaps mission is a better translation than invitation. It basically is the activity of not inviting only the non-Muslims to Islam, but also purifying the religious lives of the more nominal Muslims, and even purifying further the religious lives of practicing Muslims. So it is an activity that includes all of society, both Muslims and non-Muslims. And in Egypt, the Islamic movement has been very dawah focused, and this includes charity and philanthropy. So charity or good works is thought of as an essential part of dawah. So you can correct the religious lives of people, you can control the religious lives of people only through providing for the people and creating a balanced society. So that there can be no real good religious activity unless you are at the same time constituting a balanced society, balanced in terms of wealth. So the Turkish religious counterpart of the term dawah is not davet, which is, the exact same term taken from Arabic and Turkified, pronounced and written in a Turkish way, davet. But davet just means invitation in Turkish. I mean, no big religious connotations. Or there is dava in Turkish as well. And dava is mission, but it is mostly used by the radical left rather than the religious movements. And in Turkey, the closest counterpart, there is no exact counterpart, but the closest counterpart is tebliğ, another word from Arabic. The Quranic pronunciation is tabliğ. And it is very similar to dawah. So it is basically, again, this mission of spreading Islam, but it has different connotations. And again, I won't go into all of the depth, but I will just point out in the context of this talk that tebliğ does not necessarily incorporate charity philanthropy, whereas dawah does in most cases. And this is not simply due to, you know, centuries of difference, and the connotations of these words have been changing throughout even the recent decades. So the Turkish charitable counterpart of dawah is hizmet. Again, another word taken from Arabic, khidma, which more directly translates to English as service. And it's not just simply service to the poor. It is, again, a very broad concept with many connotations. But in the Turkish context, this hizmet, which includes charity and philanthropy and service to the poor, also includes service to the state and to the nation. So it has strong nationalistic and statist connotations, not statist in the economic sense, but statist in the political sense. And hizmet might or might not include charity. So it's, you know, I mean, depends on the association, depends on the context, depends on who you are speaking to. So the differences begin from there, but do not end there between these two movements. The more interesting differences come in the way the fields are structured. So the Egyptian Islamic field is quite fragmented, but fragmented does not mean weak, as I will explain in a moment. So there are major players in confrontation with each other, not just competition, but confrontation with each other. Al-Azhar, the most institutionalized place of education in the whole Islamic world, is in Cairo. And it has a official and somewhat modernized version of Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest Orthodox movement in the world. And then more Puritan groups, which have also come to be very influential. They were not so maybe 3 decades ago, but now they're among the major players. So the field is fragmenting further and further. They are called Salafis, even though it is a somewhat misleading term. But I'll just stick to this title for the moment. So there is no unquestioned authority of Islam in Egypt. Okay, people, the believing, practicing Muslims can subscribe to different authorities. But this fragmentation does not mean weakness, especially in the context of charity. The political, charitable, and the mission activities, the dawah activities, have been tightly integrated throughout a century, perhaps beginning in the early 1900s, even before the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there is almost an inseparable link between these three. You know, politics, charity, and religious mission go together. So there is like religious vigor and rigor all around you. Okay, and especially the communitarian organizations have been mobilizing their resources along these lines. In the lines of what they call Fragmented Shamil, which is like a comprehensive understanding of Islam, which includes not just a mental understanding, but practically Islam should be all-inclusive and comprehensive. And these organizations control civil society in multiple ways. Okay, so there is quite tight communal control. But despite all of these, so these are the strengths of the Egyptian field in contrast to the Turkish one. The meaning of good works, of khair, is very much contested because, you know, again, the believers do not submit to one authority, a central authority. And these authorities are not, again, they're not simply in competition, but in confrontation. So the meaning of khair, what it exactly entails, is open to interpretation. And not interpretation in a light and intellectual way, but in a practical and confrontational way. by contrast, there was a period in which the Islamic movement in Turkey was also mobilized along these lines of comprehensive Islam under the Refah Party, but that mobilization lasted very short. And then when this party was pushed out of existence, another political force split from it with a new vision, a non-communitarian, neoliberal vision, and then that wing of the movement merged with the state. And the vision of that new Islamic force was actually separating the political, charitable, and the religious missions. So, in contrast to Egypt, this doesn't mean there is only one religious authority in Turkey, but there are competing authorities without any confrontation between them, or until very recently, that there has been a confrontation ever since early 2013, but we don't know where it is going. So from roughly 1999 until 2013, the religious practicing population was united, a crushing majority of it was united behind the Justice and Development Party, which also became the state. So you have one Islamic authority which becomes the state, the new regime. And that also results in a unified charity field where charity or good works come to mean one single thing. Okay? So there is no stark contestation of what good works entail in Turkey. So the overall balances in each field. So again, Egypt is a fragmented field. Now I'm talking not about the Islamic fields, but the charitable Islamic fields. So not the religious component of it, but the charitable good works component of it. So the communitarian, what I call the communitarian mission associations, are the dominant players in the charitable field. And the volunteer-based market-oriented associations are the subordinate players. In Turkey, there is no such fragmentation in the field. Professionalized market-oriented associations constitute virtually the whole field, and they have marginalized or even pushed to extinction the communitarian associations. And the remaining communitarian associations, at least some of them, have taken a redistributive turn. So another lesson of this slide is that communitarian and marketized do not necessarily mean the same things in Egypt and Turkey. So some very irregular numbers from each of the countries, very sharp increase in the number and ratio of religiously oriented charity organizations, but the numbers are not exactly comparable because they are recorded and registered quite differently in the cases. So now I'm going to cover, even though I don't have much time, I have 10 minutes or so left, I'm going to try to cover each of these 4 types of associations and give some examples from each of them. So what I call the communitarian dawah or communitarian mission associations, they want to basically establish a moral society without immense wealth differences. And they distinguish themselves and their members and their volunteers from the rest of society by heavy involvement in religious orthodoxy. And most of the managers are volunteers, and the staff is paid very little. So the activities are not marketized, so they're not imbued with a market ethic. So I have some quotes here and there and some examples from the organizations, but yeah, I won't go into these. Maybe this one could be interesting. So I asked these people, what do you think causes poverty? And one of the rural, heavily Salafi Associations, its manager, and who was also its founder, told me that it's basically the people at the top of society, and if we obey God's book, then poverty will be basically resolved as an issue. But then, interestingly, he started to meld in Arab socialist themes into what he was saying. So he said, yeah, factories, state factories should be everywhere, and they should employ everybody, and they should, provide housing to everybody. So, when you study these things on the ground, discourses and dispositions really start to blend into each other. But as a generalization, I can easily say that the communitarian associations in Egypt, their volunteers, staff, and managers blamed basically the power holders and the wealthy members of society for the poverty in Egypt. And, well, also the lack of piety among the poor too. So the poor also had to be corrected, but not in their work lives and market lives, but mostly in their religion. So that's also the line of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then there are the subordinate players in Egypt, and I say subordinate, but they have fragmented the field. They are a huge presence in Egypt, and they are mostly founded by, managed by old members of the Muslim Brotherhood, so people who have split from the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s and 1990s. Mostly professionals, and the activities of these organizations are the provision of necessities and some income-generating activities on the side. And their goal is the spreading of volunteering mentality, which we will not encounter much in the Turkish case, and the cultivation of the market subject. And they distinguish themselves, especially from these more communitarian associations, by emphasizing their youth, their novelty, and their attack against traditional Egyptian culture, and their specialization and expertise in affairs of management, managing charity and philanthropy. And the managers and the staff, they are career professionals, so not only are they well paid, but they have strong anticipation of promotion in what they're doing. But despite this, even in this subordinate world of market-oriented activity, still provision of necessities weighed much more heavily when compared to this marketization of the poor. So that's what's going to differentiate even the market-oriented Egyptian philanthropies and charities from the Turkish ones. Okay, what is also distinctive about these associations in Egypt is their heavy merger with the state. And now I'm talking about the Mubarak state. So I conducted this research before the 2011 revolt. They had merged with the Egyptian state, the old regime. Not that they liked it, but they were much more pragmatic. So they're happy to play with whoever is in power. So, professionalized market-oriented associations. Market orientation looks similar to Egypt, but it is much stronger and much more smoothened out. In what sense? Yeah, there is still some provision of necessities, but training the poor and making them market subjects is an ever-present theme all the time. So they do not only charity in the traditional sense, they conduct conferences, big research projects on poverty. Okay? And they really want to transform the lives of the poor. And not only expertise and specialization, but they emphasize science all the time, social science, sociology, economics, political science. Just like the Egyptian organizations, they attack traditional Turkish culture. And not only are they career professionals, but the recruitment techniques in the Turkish organizations are much more complex. They they eliminate many people through thick surveys before they even start to interview people. Okay, I don't have much time, so I'm going to jump over these quotations. And I should also emphasize the merger between the state, the party, and the associations here. So even though in spirit, you know, dawah or tabligh and politics and charity are differentiated, actually they are all being conducted under the new regime and unquestioning allegiance to the new regime established by the Justice and Development Party. And you know, most of these people are from or have been involved with the Justice and Development Party or its predecessors. So what I want to get at through looking at the smaller associations is that whenever there's a smaller association in Egypt, they take the Muslim Brotherhood as their model and the activities of the smaller associations, and maybe only secondarily these newer associations. But in Turkey, there is no alternative model. I mean, the major organizations all follow a very entrenched market logic. So the unification of the field trickles down in a very uniform way in Turkey. So what we find in the margins of the field in Turkey are communitarian associations with redistributive tendencies. So they downplay their religious mission, so in stark contrast to the Egyptian communitarian associations. They are much more suspicious of wealth when compared to the Egyptian associations. And they also have a discourse of responsibility and pushing the poor to be responsible. But they have a very different version of responsibilization when compared to the market-oriented associations. So the market-oriented associations want the poor to be responsible, to produce, to be, you know, entrepreneurial, etc. So in Turkey, even these communitarian associations have made aid conditional, but conditional on something like political participation. In what sense? Well, the issue is they take the poor and they train them not in production or market activities, but in demanding their welfare rights from the state. So I study one of these associations where the managers and the staff of the organization were also unemployed people. And they slowly, in 5-10 years, learned the intricacies of the welfare system in Turkey, and they taught the system to the newcomers. Okay, so they're basically creating welfare subjects instead of market subjects, but still, you know, different from old-style communitarianism. Okay, here's a more analytical table, but drawing all of these comparisons and contrasts together, but I won't go into this. So what are the broader implications of this research? Well, it might be true that there is this world historical trend of recreating every human activity in the image of market exchange, and this is what the critical scholarship has been emphasizing. And it is true that, you know, acts of caring are transferred into capital accumulation through the creation or recreation of the poor as these entrepreneurial subjects. But not only that, of course, but also through solidifying the new middle classes and the new entrepreneurs, new pious entrepreneurs through these activities. So these associations are becoming not only sites of the creation of poor neoliberal subjects, but they are also uniting the pious entrepreneurial and professional classes against the classes of the old regime. Yeah, all of this is happening. So maybe I'm on the same page with the critical scholarship after this painful research. But I also want to point out that some communitarian ways of giving are sustained, and some are transformed into something different, and we don't know where that different thing will go yet. Just to sum all of this up, instead of assuming these broad changes of modernization or neoliberalization, from tradition to modernity, or from irrational giving to rational giving, or on the critical side of the scholarship, from egalitarianism to responsibilization, we should really dig deep into the contexts and study the ways in which communitarianism, responsibilization, dawah.
The differences, what would explain the kind of organizational and dispositional differences between Egypt and Turkey, how the arrangement of these different communal versus marketized versions of caring. Is there some kind of causal relationship that's there, either class or their integration into the world market vis-a-vis kind of, and larger international NGOs, WTO kind of requirements, or anything that might explain the kind of particular balance?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can. I have a causal: political, military, diplomatic, cultural. So certainly Turkey has pushed more on that front. And that goes into partially explaining the differences in the political realm and the religious realm. So the factors I talked about, so a more unified Islamic movement that has evolved into a unified neoliberal party, which has eventually evolved into a new neoliberal Islamic regime. Now, all of these happened through sometimes aggressive, sometimes subtle nudging by world powers. So Turkey is the poster child of the neoliberal world order ever since 1980. Again, not just in economic sense, but cultural, political senses as well. So, Turks are the good Muslims. They are the Muslims who fight in Afghanistan together with Americans and in Lebanon, etc. So, there is a more united global support behind the neoliberalization of the Turkish Islamic movement. Whereas the signals from Washington are not, they are not straightforward when it comes to Egyptian Islamists. So, Obama supported the coup, for example. So instead of, pushing the Islamists to be more neoliberal, the decision was to support the coup. And this has many, many reasons, and I won't go into them because this is going to turn into a diplomacy talk, right? But my point is, yeah, there are these different ways of integrating to the world, but and maybe I should have fleshed out in this talk, but they get heavily filtered through the national contexts. There is no El-Azhar in Turkey. That's a huge thing. There is no huge Islamic establishment with its own legitimacy. So there's also an official Islam in Turkey, but it has never been as legitimate as the official Islam in Egypt. So, it's not easy to take over El-Azhar. But the Justice and Development Party has easily taken over official Islam in Turkey. Yes.
I was wondering about the concept of I think the critique was that new organizations were trying to marketize the poor. But how do you separate that between, perhaps they would say, we're recognizing the current economic reality, and if we really want to help them, we have to help them adapt to the current economic reality. Is there a distinction between just trying to make them a cog in the machine versus this is what we need, this is how we help them now in this current context?
Yeah, that's a good question. So of course, they are not saying we are making them cogs in the machine. They are saying we are making them more rational and more pragmatic. And they're also themselves rational and pragmatic professionals. So the most pragmatic thing to do, it appears, is to turn people into market subjects from a narrow, ahistorical, professional point of view. You do that only if you haven't understood 1929. So if you know your history lesson, you know this thing is doomed to failure. But you know that's my take on it. Of course, people don't read 1929 in the same way. So there are people who think that, well, it was a mistake actually to impose a welfare system. If the market had completely crashed, then things would be much, much better. So when it comes to 2008, it was a mistake to bail out the banks. The losers should have lost, and we should have gone from there. People draw different lessons from history, but my view is that these systems are going to fail eventually in Egypt and Turkey. So even though it might seem rational to make the poor, to turn the poor into market subjects in the span of 5 years, and even if that is doable, there's a question about that too. But in the long run, this is going nowhere. So eventually, the system is going to collapse. And when I say the system, I'm not talking about capitalism. Capitalism might be able to save itself, but neoliberalism as it is, it's bound to implode or explode. So maybe the narrower question is, and I don't have research about that, unfortunately. The narrower question is, do these marketizing projects function as long as the system is healthy, right? So let's say, again, like in the next 2 years, maybe that's the best thing to do in the next 2 years. So that kind of research, unfortunately, has not been conducted. So that would require a completely different research design. And that wasn't the question I was asking. And to my knowledge, so I haven't looked at all the unpublished dissertations and all the unpublished MAs. I have looked at some of them. I have looked at all the published work. Unfortunately, nobody has done that research. So to study whether these programs help the poor or not. Of course, just one last sentence. Of course, the associations have their success stories, right? They single out, so they are helping presumably hundreds of thousands of people, and then they pull out 2 or 3 success stories. Somebody who was very poor in rural Egypt and then became a self-sustaining peasant in 5 years. But I mean, we have no way of knowing whether those are representative stories. So we do need more research on that, and that's not my kind of research. So a question back. So you want to take a question?
Actually, I think it's great if you do it.
Okay, so it's, yeah.
I'm curious about the set of humanities role within Egypt, the one that you said about sort of Arab socialist ideals. And I'm wondering if it's less so
Fascinating, and I wish we had gotten a chance to look at some of those other publication slides. I wonder if you could concretize the activities of these communitarian versus market-oriented versus more neoliberal charities. So I'm thinking kind of very stereotypically, giving food to the poor versus skills training versus microcredit organizations. I'm wondering where you draw those lines.
Yeah, I didn't go that much into microcredit. So, I mean, the organizations I looked at did not do that. So, what differentiated them was whether they invested in these training and development activities or not. So, actually, when you look at the way they speak about each other, that reveals a lot too. Because what I call, these are all pseudonyms except the Muslim Brotherhood and the Justice and Development Party. What I call the Nur Association contrasted itself all the time to what I have called the Piety Association, which is like, one is the largest communitarian organization in Egypt, the other is the largest market-oriented association. So, first of all, they say most of them are good Muslims. Well, it also depends on whom you speak to in the organization. But the founder said they are all good Muslims, but they don't try to make people Muslims or even good Muslims. So, unlike the Piety Association. And unlike the Piety Association, they also said, we just don't, hand in bags to the poor. We don't just, keep them waiting in line. We knock on their doors and we teach them things, but not Islam, literacy, for example. And they're saying, the Piety Association just takes care of people's immediate needs, then they disappear. Of course, that's a misrepresentation, but I'm just talking about the way they're imagining the dominant people in the field. How does this feel on the ground in Turkey? It feels much more systematic and science-oriented. And of course, science is always mainstream science, right? So again, this is a feel of how the Turkish neoliberals sound. So this man is talking about his childhood, and from Robert Wilfnow, for example, from the American Sociology of Religion, we learn that people learn how to be good altruistic people from their families and from the history of giving of their families. And to my surprise, I found out that people learn to be good neoliberals from their families in Egypt, or that's how they remember their past, actually. And of course, this remembering of the past is filtered through these scientific concepts. So, culture of poverty. You wouldn't find many sociologists at Berkeley going by this concept, but in Turkish sociology and anthropology, it's a huge concept. And there are people mired in the culture of poverty, and his family, even though it was a working class family, was not one of them. So, the whole point becomes how to make sure that people do not have the culture of poverty. And how do you prevent people from having the culture of poverty? Well, you aggressively cultivate a culture of, science, not culture. But basically science. You teach them how to think scientifically and think and act devoid of emotion. So, there are these people who come and whine and want bread. Well, you're not supposed to whine, right? You're supposed to think systematically as a poor person, and run after job opportunities. And they try to cultivate that in their immediate interactions every day, so that that becomes the mission. So it feels much more aggressive than in Egypt, because it is really involved in a very interventionary way in the lives of people. And the other thing, I shortly mentioned this, but they eliminate and cultivate not only the good poor and separate them from the bad poor, but also good volunteers from bad volunteers, good staff from bad staff or potential staff. The recruitment strategies are very elaborate, or at least they're claimed to be. In the smaller associations, it's much more of a claim than actual reality, but the larger associations have become much more systematic, rationalized over a decade and a half. So things feel much, drier in Turkey, very dry and, aggressive and dry. Yes?
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on notions of equality in political Islam. How far is equality seen as a basic
Well, in gender, I think it's more straightforward. But I should also say we're talking about mainstream political Islam, right? Because I mean, there are many heterodox interpretations of political Islam, and some are much more egalitarian, some are much more inegalitarian. So I'm really talking about the core of the movement. So if we talk about the core of the movement, regarding gender, it's a more straightforward story. There might be more or less emphasis on inequality, but the assumption is inequality. When it comes to class, there's a more contested scene, especially historically over the course of the 20th century. The ideas about class inequality and poverty have fluctuated a lot. So the core idea, as I again briefly mentioned in passing, in pre-modern, if we can call it that, pre-modern Islam or Orthodox historical Islam, was that fate was at the bottom of wealth differences. So you don't actually choose your class. You are born into a class. And that doesn't happen because of structure, which is like a modern scientific concept, of course, but it happens because you have been placed there by God. And it's a part of a test. So some people get tested through poverty, some through wealth. So what are you going to do with your poverty? Are you going to be a good person despite your poverty? Are you going to, if you are wealthy, are you going to give away your wealth? So that was the encouragement in historical Orthodox Islam. You should give it away. But even historical Orthodox Islam is not made of one cloth. Even within the mainstream, there was a lot of contestation about how much you're supposed to give. So is it just the 2.5%? Is it just a little more? Is it much, much more? So there is not only simple debates about that, but there are movements around that. There are fights around that. So when it comes to the 20th century, there is a lot more conscious struggle about the meaning of poverty. And right in the middle of the century, up until the 1970s, you see a heavy socialist influence on some political Islam, like the Muslim Brotherhood. But not Maududi, for example. I mean, there is so much variation. Maududi in Pakistan remains like a private property-oriented, inegalitarian Islamist. But the Muslim Brotherhood is under the influence of not Bolshevik socialism, but state socialism. Nationalist socialism, Arab socialism. So after the 1970s, you see a more capitalistic neoliberal trend. So the assumption starts to be that it is neither fate nor structure. It is basically choice. You can choose your class. You can strive you can work your way out of poverty. And that has become the official line in Turkish Islamism. And the debate in Egypt still is evolving. So today, as of today, I wouldn't say there is an official line about the reasons behind poverty, the nature of inequality, etc. in Egypt. It's completely fragmented, completely without a unified authority structure.
And with that, I think it's time to say thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk.
Thank you for all the questions.